$237 million. That's how much Fossil paid for the Skagen brand back in 2012. Was it a good purchase? Well, in this video, I'll be taking my first look at one of their watches to work out whether they're worth buying or if they're just another Daniel Wellington clone in disguise. I've been meaning to review these watches for some time now, given their prominence in the YouTube comment section of my videos. So when Amazon reached out offering to send me some watches, it was a no-brainer that this would be one of them. Funnily enough, this watch arrived with a tag featuring an RRP of €159 on it. Not to spoil it, but I don't think you should ever be spending that sort of money on basic fashion watches like these. Amazon UK currently has this listed at a much more reasonable £85, which I'll link to in the video description. I was surprised to find out that this brand had actually been around for decades before the Fossil acquisition, first selling watches in the early 90s. Looking at the progression of this brand, it feels like a bit of a precursor to the modern day social media fashion watches. I remember occasionally seeing these in department stores when I was a kid. The brand's based out of Denmark, but their watches are made in the Far East. So that's the brand, let's talk about the watch. This is the reference SKW6082. Also listed as the Ancher, which is a Danish word. I had a look online and apparently that's how to pronounce it. I'm assuming this refers to the famous Danish artists of the same name. Visually, it instantly reminds me of some of the Bauhaus Braun designs, but even slimmer. This one comes in at a mere 8.3mm deep, which includes the domed glass. Without it, you'd be looking closer to 6.5mm, which is incredibly thin. This ensures the watch lies extremely flat on wrist, which is something bound to appeal to many of you out there. Online, Amazon has this listed as having a 45mm diameter, which isn't accurate. It's actually a more reasonable 40mm with a short 45.7mm lug-to-lug size. If you're someone with a skinny wrist like mine and you're looking for a watch that's got a large dial, I guess this one will give you that without having to opt for the chunkiness that typically comes with larger watches. At this price point, those set of dimensions are only really possible by using a quartz movement, which we'll talk about later. Outside of the size, the case is done to an okay standard. It's constructed of 316L stainless steel, which is found in tons of watches, and features a lightly brushed finish across the majority of the surface. There are one or two indicators that this is a budget watch. You'll notice little nicks here and there. The finishing on the lugs in particular is somewhat inconsistent. I'll throw two of them up side by side here. One of them's got a really nice sharp finish, while a couple of the others are a bit more sloppy. Overall though, for their target market, it works. Form over function is the deal when it comes to the crown. Due to the quartz movement, you won't be touching this often, and thankfully so, given the absence of any grip whatsoever. It's also incredibly small to fit the minimal look of the piece, which I guess it does. Flipping the watch over reveals the glossy snapback case, which provides a small amount of water resistance. They're claiming 30 meters here, which essentially makes this watch splash-proof and rain-resistant. Outside of that, I'd keep this out of water whenever possible. Before we talk about the dial, I've got to mention those lugs first. Now, we've already looked at the inconsistent finishing, but there's also something else. You'll notice 4 tiny screws on the rear of the case. But this time, they aren't holding the case back in place. They're there to secure the straps, which is something I've never seen before. You can unscrew them and slide the straps straight out. It appears the screws fasten straight through the leather, which is left with 2 small holes in it. While this is peculiar and somewhat interesting, I'm hesitant to praise it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I question how this method would impact durability in the long run. Those holes are set very near the end of the strap material. I wonder if this could start ripping at some point. Secondly, it's going to be more difficult to replace. As with the swatches I covered a few weeks ago, you aren't going to be able to reuse your existing traditional lug straps unless you fancy slicing the ends off them, which means you're going to have more limited choice when it comes to straps. Also, I'm not a fan of the open sides on these. Maybe they're there for practicality's sake so you can slide the strap out easily. Who knows? Either way, they don't look particularly attractive and they kind of look like a snake has bitten hold of your strap. Luckily, when looking at the watch overall, the dial still demands most attention. As I alluded to earlier, it's wide and open with a crowd-pleasing minimalist design that's reminiscent of other popular wristwatches I've covered before. It's very simple, yet not completely boring, giving you a versatile aesthetic that looks pretty good with a variety of outfits. This has a very standard chapter ring with the familiar numbers at each hour. The logo is also printed to the surface in the typical central position. There's a small date window sitting just above the 6 o'clock marker, featuring a small black border which I like. Its diminutive nature suits this watch rather well. When you look closely, you can tell it's a budget watch though. The inked areas are really glossy and the wide dial looks quite plain and smooth. A little bit like how with those Daniel Wellingtons it almost looks like a bit of paper, this isn't far off that. The hands also fall short of the perimeter markers by a notable amount, which highlights just some of the areas that are cut to keep the costs down. However, I like the shape and colour of the second hand. The blue is quite nice and suits this watch. So yeah, overall, I think the watch is quite nice to look at. And upon receiving the watch, I was surprised to discover that this mineral glass was lightly domed. I assumed this would just be flat, so during the unboxing, I wondered why light coming off it had some curvature. I took a look against the dark surface, and sure enough, the crystal was domed. This is a tiny bit more expensive than the flat glass that's used in loads of lower-end wristwatches. And while it doesn't provide any additional performance, it sure looks good. It's very subtle with this Skagen, which means it doesn't spoil the slim design either. It doesn't provide any noticeable distortion and should give you the typical mild scratch resistant properties of mineral crystal. At £85, that's fine. At £160, not quite so much. Unfortunately, I was unable to verify the exact movement within the watch. I tried both of my removal tools and the rear simply wouldn't budge. I even scratched the rear in pursuit. I didn't want to push any harder. Unfortunately, the movement doesn't seem to be listed anywhere online. If I had to guess, I'd say it was possibly a Miyota quartz that we see in loads of similar watches to this. It's fairly quiet and seems accurate enough, though, as with many quartz watches, this one isn't aligned very well, meaning the second hand usually ticks between the markers rather than on them, which is frustrating. As I can't verify the movement, I guess there's a fair chance this could just be some sort of high-end Chinese movement too. The only thing left to talk about is the strap. This leaves a lot to be desired and honestly is quite poor. It feels cheap, plasticky, and scratches very easily. The stainless steel buckle emblazoned with the logo is rather nice, though it doesn't change my opinion that this will not wear well over time. The genuine leather is rather supple, so it's fairly comfortable on wrist, just don't expect it to look particularly good after a few months of usage. This combined with the weird screw lugs mentioned before, give me the impression that this is another area where costs have clearly been cut. Are they giving you a bad strap so that it wears out quickly and then have to go back to them to get a strap because it's almost like a proprietary system? Perhaps. To be clear, I'd probably say this is a fraction better than those from Movement that I tried a while ago. It's probably on a par with the strap from Daniel Wellington despite the styling differences. If you're only thinking about wearing this occasionally, that isn't going to be such a problem, but for regular usage, it's not great. So what are my thoughts and who do I think this is for or not for? It's clear to me that most of the decisions made with this watch align with its purpose as a fashion watch and nothing more. This watch looks good but isn't highly spec'd or super practical, and I guess that makes sense. If you are really into horology, I'd be surprised if this ticked your boxes. And as a fashion watch, I think you probably could do worse. This watch does feel a tad better than the likes of a Timex Fairfield, which you'd expect given the retail price, yet it still costs about 20% less than most Daniel Wellington watches, which are currently about £100 to £150 on Amazon UK. It feels less cookie cutter than the latter option, and I think it's a slightly better watch overall despite its flaws. I think the case is higher quality, I think the design looks better. I just wouldn't spend 150 odd, I probably wouldn't recommend spending over 100 either. It's a real shame that Casio discontinued that Sapphire model, because in situations like this, I would have just pointed you in that direction given the looks and specs. If you like the look of this Skagen, it might be worth picking up, but I think £85 is the very highest you should be spending on something like this. Frankly, the RRP is ridiculous. Currently, there's another very similar Skagen on Amazon UK, which is about 12 quid cheaper. If that also appeals to you, I'd just go with that cheaper one. I'll link it down below too, as they basically look the same apart from the chapter ring. If not, I'd recommend saving up a bit of money and opting for something different instead. Maybe something like the quartz version of this stern glass that I've got on here, which is also super skinny, and it comes with slightly better materials. Or one of the lower end Junkers models that I've already discussed before. Some of them are really affordable, especially when they're on discount. They're not far off, and I think they look better. The white Bambino is also a good choice, but it certainly feels bigger on wrist than the Skagen, and you don't get the amazing lack of depth that you get with this one. In the last review, we covered the Nezumi Lowe's chronograph. Here's where that one ended up on our wall of watches. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this Skagen below. Do you think it's amazing, rubbish, a scam? On a wall is this watch.
Low quality Chinese garbage.
Uncool, cool, or ice cold? If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.